Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our rebranded podcast, The Global Talk. Many of you will have previously known our podcast as Scale Up Stateside, which was founded by the PGC Group. This year, under our new brand of Workwell Global, which is the combined business of PGC, Six Cats and Whitefin, we decided to give the podcast an upgrade and shift our view to align with recruiting and doing business internationally. Of course, the US being the largest staffing market in the world, we'll always be keen to pay a focus on that strategic market. But now we get to bring you insights from other key recruitment and staffing markets too. So it's a great pleasure that I get to kick off our new podcast and introduce the Global Talk to you all. Now, if this is actually your first time listening, you are so welcome. I'm Amy Davies. I'm the Managing Director of Workwell Global, and we specialise in supporting recruiters expand to international markets by providing employer of record services for their contractors and clients. We can help you scale your contract recruitment business quickly and drive overall enterprise value to your company. So, it's January, it's the beginning of the year, and what has now become quite the tradition is we will kick the year off with looking at the key markets for the year ahead with key trends and opportunities. So in keeping with that tradition, today joining me is no stranger to our podcast, and as such, I'm delighted to welcome back John Nurthen of SIA. Hi, John.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us again. For those of you who don't know John, he is the Executive Director of Global Research and heads up the international research arm of SIA. I've heard John speak at numerous events and indeed on our show before. So it's great to have you back with us and helping us work out what the year ahead holds in store for us all, John.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to work through in the next 30 minutes. Today, we're going to be covering what were the top markets of 2024, what are the forecasts for 2025, along with some key staffing trends to be aware of. Now, if anyone has any questions you would like us to answer in today's session, as always, please drop them in the chat or comment function, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can without distracting away from the agenda set before us. If we don't get time to finish your questions, we'll come back to you after the episode is concluded and make sure we get to answer those. So let us know in the comments, kicking us off, with some of the international markets you are already operating in today, so we can see if we can shape the conversation around what you want to hear. So, John, let's get into it. As we know, there's a clear relationship between economic patterns and the staffing industry performance. And the industry has almost been at the mercy of the economic backdrop for the last number of years. And so before today's show, I wanted to test the sentiment on LinkedIn with a poll, which you also seen yesterday, John. And I basically asked my community how they were feeling about the recruitment market in 2025. And I have some of those results here. So I asked if people were expecting big things, if they were cautiously optimistic, so semi-positive, or if they were feeling more conservative. And funnily enough, John, the sentiment was really strong, with 54% expecting big things, 42% were cautiously optimistic, with 4% feeling more conservative. Now, John, I'm ready for you to burst the bubble on this positive sentiment, but it's not as big of a burst as last year, I'm sure. But should we start by talking about a breakdown of the markets last year that generated the most revenue?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to pour cold water on that positive sentiment.
Not with you, John.
But one of the endearing characteristics of staffing executives is they are always positive. And when you do get sentiment like that, I mean, I do think you should be cautious, because people want there to be a positive market. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be positive. And if you look at some of the recent market sentiment, some of the big public listed staffing firms have reported their Q4 numbers. They look a little bit negative. So we can talk about this year, but your question was about what was positive last year. The markets that were positive were all in Asia. They weren't in Europe, I'm afraid. So the big markets that were positive, Japan was a very good market. that's a market that is benefiting from lots of structural growth. It was a market where it was illegal to provide temporary agency workers until the 1990s. So it's not a market that's wholly dependent on GDP for growth. So Japan was great. The other big Asian markets, China and India, were very positive. We had China with forecast 14% growth last year, and 16% growth and 13% growth for India. So those were the two fastest growing markets. Elsewhere, it was pretty negative. We had a small amount of growth forecast in Italy. I guess if you did operate in Europe, then you needed to be in Southern Europe to see any signs of positivity. You certainly didn't want to be in the US. We had the US market declining by 10%. So it's been a very difficult market. And the interesting thing with the US market, and this probably does apply to other markets as well, you said in your introduction that there's a close relationship between economic growth and staffing industry. That's become strangely disconnected in the US. If you look at where US GDP was last year, it was actually pretty good. And you would have expected there to be stronger staffing growth. And for one reason or another, there wasn't. So there's been lots of reasons postulated for why that might be the case. The fact that clients might be labor hoarding, the fact that there was the Great Resignation, people not returning to work post-COVID, the fact that there are alternative ways of getting work, sort of people working on statement of work rather than temporary agency workers. And the fact that there are new technologies, these freelance platforms, so increasing use of freelancers. So there was lots of reasons postulated, and I think maybe all of them in combination did have an impact. But when you look at the broader trend for the US market, really what you do see is a market that's just recalibrating. That COVID was such a sort of shock to the system, to the US and other countries as well. And if you look at the market in broader terms, really the US market is a steady, slow-growing market. It doesn't have the exciting growth that some of the emerging staffing markets have. If you look at I think compound annual growth rate for the US market over the last 10 years has been about 2.5%.
Yeah.
So it may be sort of negative at the moment. We think it's going to be much better this year. We do think there will be growth. But we do need to start to see some signs of improvement in the market now, and we're not quite getting it. We got good data on the US market in particular because we have a relationship with Bullhorn, and so we get daily numbers on that market, and we did see some signs of improvement leading up to the Christmas period, but then as we got closer to Christmas, that sort of optimism seemed to fade away a bit, and we haven't seen much signs of better growth already this year. So, we were in the same place last year when we had this discussion last January. We were saying, well, everybody's expecting the market's going to be getting better in the second half, and it didn't. So I think we're in the same place. We're expecting things to improve. The market will eventually turn around. So we think that that we need to see some signs of improvement sooner rather than later.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just interesting how some of the issues post-pandemic are still impacting the market today. And I know we're going to kind of talk about the key trends globally towards the end of today's show, but that's great in terms of understanding last year. So year ahead then, how are some of these markets expected to perform? Which are kind of the positive markets, which are kind of not quite there on the same similar growth rates?
Yeah, well, we think that the markets that were particularly weak last year will be better. We're forecasting the US largest market. We're forecasting 5% growth this year, which would be great if we can get that.
That's a moderate growth rate. Sorry, John, because I know in previous years you've spoken about the different types of growth rates that we've seen in the US as being at that moderate growth rate. What would 5% be considered for our audience?
Yeah, 5% would be pretty good if we get that out of the US market. But like other countries, it varies considerably by segment. So one of the reasons that the US market has been weak, there's been a sort of overcorrection in the healthcare staffing market. So during COVID and the year after, the healthcare staffing market in the US boomed, and now that's sort of fallen back. So the healthcare market has been particularly weak. IT has been weak as well, and needs to improve. So as long as we can see some improvement in those two segments in particular, then we'll see the market overall improving. Yeah. So US fingers crossed will be good. We think that throughout Europe there should be low single digit growth as well. We'll see the same stories we saw last year with the Asian markets leading. So we're expecting to get more growth out of China and India, certainly than what we see in Europe.
Yeah, brilliant. Just when you look at the European markets, because I know a lot of our listeners are based in the UK, have been successfully generating revenue from international markets. And there's probably many of our listeners actually who are maybe at the stage where they're considering opening offices up. So when we think about Europe as kind of the case to look at, what would you say are the emerging markets across Europe specifically?
Yeah, just looking at Europe, then it's interesting, that people are very much focused on the better known markets. People think the UK market is attractive, and that the Dutch market is attractive, that the German market is attractive. But if you look at where growth has been, it's actually been in Southern Europe. You'd been better if you'd have started a staffing business 10 years ago. You would have been much better to launch it in Spain or Italy than you would have been UK, Netherlands, or Germany. The other markets that have always been good have been the Scandinavian markets as well. So we rate those quite highly. I think from previous discussions how highly we rate the Irish market as well, which has got lots of positive characteristics as well. But things can change when we do our most attractive staffing markets analysis. I think we analyze about 70 different countries, trying to determine how they compare, where the best opportunities are. We've got, for example, Sweden in joint sixth place based on our analysis last year, and then the Swedish government changed the legislation. And about the last place you want to open a staffing business at the moment is Sweden, because it's pretty poor. So we do the analysis, but things can change pretty rapidly, especially if it comes to changing regulation.
Yeah, I know we've spoken about it before, but the geographical calculator, apologies if I'm not calling it by its right title, that you guys have is really great when considering different markets, because it kind of builds in all those considerations. So kind of what's growing, but also what's the legislation like there, how easy is it to operate there, employment benefits, all those things that go into making those types of decisions. The calculator is pretty good for. What's coming out top of that calculator then, John, at the minute?
Yeah, well, to give it its correct title, it's the massive staffing markets. So it's a report. So just to give a bit more color on what you said, we do look at 10 different characteristics of each market. So, what makes the staffing market attractive? We look at how big is the market. We look at how fast it's been growing. Recently, we look at what the longer term potential is. We look at market competition. How many staffing firms are there operating in that market as a proportion of the population? We look at general employment, economic characteristics. We look at the legislation as well, not just as it relates to staffing, but as it relates to employment issues generally. And then we look at governance. Is it easy to do business in a particular country? We look at access to human capital. Is education good? Is there a good technology infrastructure? So we look at all those characteristics, we score them, and then we also allow companies to weight those different characteristics for themselves. So we don't weight them, but depending on what your risk appetite is, I mean, if you don't care whether or not the government's corrupt, and you're prepared to go into that market, then forget about the governance score. if you're not so worried about human capital, get rid of that as well. So you can adjust those and weight them appropriately depending on what's important to you. So your own analysis could be different, but unweighted, the market that came out number one in our analysis last year was actually Indonesia. So again, we're sort of focusing on those Asian markets: Indonesia, Hong Kong, India, South Korea, Taiwan, China, New Zealand, interestingly, and then the Scandinavian markets.
Brilliant. Okay, and obviously you need to be an SIA member to access the tool. Okay, what would be really great now is just to hone in for the last part of our session really on some of the staffing trends. For those of you who haven't seen this report before, John actually is the author of the Staffing Trends Report. It is excellent. I can't recommend it enough. I told John before we joined that I actually read it now with his voice in my head. I can't help it. So that's how I kind of read the report. But the report is excellent, as I say. It's in its 8th year. So there's, a good amount of history that's come before, and many businesses use it as a key predictor of markets for the year ahead and to gain insights on the trends and opportunities to maximize. So what I wanted to do is just pull out some of those key trends that I think our audience will be most interested to hear. And the first one I want to ask you about, John, is the lazy W. Do you want to talk to us about that, please?
Yeah, I tell you, before I do that, one thing that people would be interested to know is this is actually a complimentary report. So you mentioned that you need to be a member to get access to our most attractive staffing data. Yeah. We like to make the staffing trends report freely available, just so we share more widely what we think important trends are. The other thing about that trends report to bear in mind is what we try to do as well is not just focus on those sort of mega trends that you see every single year. I mean, everybody knows that there are certain sort of demographic issues that were important last year and the year before and the year before that. So we try to come up with things that we think are going to be a little bit different this year compared to last year. And the lazy W, so that refers to during COVID, there was lots of discussion, certainly within our research team, about what was going to be the shape of the recovery. Is it going to be a U shape? We're just going to go down and then we're going to come out and everything will be okay. Is it going to be a V, sort of a much sharper drop and a sharper growth? Is it going to be the W, or was it going to be the dreaded I? The I recovery is where you just keep going down and down forever. So fortunately, it doesn't look like it's the I, but now it's obvious that it is a W. We saw certainly strong decline in the market. We saw a surprisingly strong recovery. But then sadly, following that, the market declined again. And now we're sort of hoping that we're about to see that lift up again. And so I came up with the term a lazy W because it's not like that shape, more like, and then, yeah. So the big question is, how lazy is that W going to be? We're hoping it's not going to be that lazy, but we're still waiting to see signs of improvements in the markets.
So again, cautiously optimistic about where we are on that W. So it's going upwards, but a lot lazier and slower than we were perhaps expecting it to. And you also talk in the report, and somebody shared the link actually, so that's great because I was thinking we would do that after the show. So if anyone wants to access the report, that is in the comments. Thank you, Francesca. It absolutely is by magic, so appreciate you doing that for us. But you also talk in the report quite heavily about AI use cases, and everybody talks about AI, but what I found particularly interesting is your view on how penetrative AI has become throughout all parts of a staffing firm. So how do you see that impacting the industry this year?
Yeah, well, I guess we've been guilty in the past of just focusing narrowly on AI as it applies to finding candidates, engaging candidates. So when we've done webinars of our own, when we've put on conferences, we talk about AI as it relates to chatbots and how we're going to make engagements with candidates and perhaps clients better. But of course, AI is just ubiquitous these days, and it's every single department within a staffing firm gets impacted by AI. So if you're the executive team, you've got the potential to have AI performance dashboards. You can have predictive analytics. You've got better market trend analysis, compliance monitoring. If you're in the finance department, you've got transaction audits, better anomaly and fraud detection, compliance verification. You can even have your own chatbot to help clients resolve their payrolling and billing inquiries. The marketing department, of course, they've got optimized advertising spend. They can use programmatic job advertising. They've got dynamic content creation. It's so much easier to create graphics and content using artificial intelligence. They can use it for competitor analysis as well. The IT department, of course, they're going to benefit from IT as well. Network optimization, improved system monitoring, and there's a sort of long list that every department gets to benefit from. So it was really to highlight the fact that it's not just AI. AI is not just about the tools that you can use to find and engage candidates. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, I like in the report there's kind of a table by kind of areas of staffing firm and what's accessible to them, and you can see how it can affect all areas of staffing firm rather than that initial resourcing element, which is where probably AI first hit recruitment firms.
Yeah, the other thing that we touched on in the report as well is this new the new buzzword agentic AI or AI agents.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like every year we get hit by another wave of AI terms. So where generative AI is old hat now. It's all about AI agents, and that's where AI has been developed to be much more autonomous. So you can sort of put it into systems, and it can learn and grow all by itself. And a number of staffing firms have started to use agentic AI. Adecco announced an initiative with Salesforce. A lot of the big software firms are getting ready to roll out important new agentic AI initiatives. I think OpenAI is supposed to be launching one this month, which is codenamed Operator. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. But it's like agentic AI is really supposed to put AI on steroids. It's all these things we've heard in the past about how it's going to impact the workforce. Well, it's going to impact. It seems like that's going to happen much sooner than people anticipated, given these latest developments in AI. And staffing firms are going to be threatened by that. It's going to mean that the nature of disruption to the labour market is going to happen maybe a little bit sooner than they anticipated, but it also gives them opportunities as well. As we said, there are a number of staffing firms that started to use agentic AI tools, and so there's some opportunities out there as well.
And attached to that, it's touched on in the report that we've seen an increasing amount of regulation pertaining to AI. What have you seen, and which do you think is most important to signal to our listeners today?
Yeah, well, the big one, of course, is the EU AI Act. And the reason that one is important is because recruitment is firmly in the crosshairs of that regulation. So the European Union highlighted what they regarded as high-risk areas, and recruitment was chosen as one of those high-risk areas, which means that there'll be an increasing spotlight, but also increasing fines if you manage to get it wrong. And I think it is a big risk for the staffing industry because you're relying on third-party technology. Your vendors are telling you, yes, we have an AI enhanced tool, but to you it's a black box. You've got is it really biased or not? Can you be sure it's not going to act inappropriately? In the past, we've seen some of the world's biggest, most sophisticated software firms make awful mistakes with the AI that they have launched. So I firmly anticipate that there's going to be some errors made by staffing firms, by the vendors that supply them with AI enhanced products, And it's very important, I think, for every staffing firm to make doubly sure that they are getting these products audited appropriately. You can get independent algorithm auditors to assess these products for you, to give you some sort of reassurance. But there's a lot of danger, I think. It's not just the EU AI Act. There's legislation pending in China. They've got legislation coming through. Canada has. In the US, there's no federal legislation, but there is legislation by state. So, for example, there's specific legislation in California. With the recent election in the US, actually what you would expect with AI regulation is that at a federal level, Donald Trump is probably going to be quite relaxed about not wanting to put too many restrictions on the development of AI. But nevertheless, legislation in the US differs very much, differs by state. So one of the other topics that we covered in the Staffing Trends report was the fact that state legislation is likely to get even more polarized. So the US is a very complicated market because, not only do you have the federal legislation, you've got the state legislation as well. And depending on what the legislation applies to, that determines whether or not it's the state legislation or the federal legislation that takes priority. So it's a bit of a minefield. The US does seem to like change in its regulations fairly frequently as well. So even if things are getting better, it's still causing people to update their systems and processes. So there's a lot of change. So I think, the US market in particular, especially if you're a firm that operates across the US, it's a very complex environment, and it's very important that you keep on top of it.
Yeah. And you're right. I kind of obviously read that part of your report with a keen interest, where you talk about this polarization of US state legislation and how staffing firms have to cope with that increasingly complex interplay between the federal, state and local laws. And so much change, and it's at a rapid pace as well, right across the state. So absolutely something for agencies operating in that space to think about this year. Very quickly, going to touch on one last trends that came out of the report. And we haven't got lots of time to talk about it, but why I wanted to mention it, you talk about the growth of outsourced solutions and how this is a key trend across multiple markets. And I think what I was particularly interested in is how that links to the acquisitional preference of buyers when it comes to staffing firms. I think you talked about 44% of those were most interested in IT and statement of work solutions as their top preference. So I wonder if you could just touch as briefly as you can on that for us.
Yeah, so staffing firms have always offered outsourced solutions, particularly IT staffing firms. But to be honest, we looked at it more closely last year as potentially one of the reasons why we weren't seeing that growth that we expected in the US market based on decent GDP. So well, maybe instead of companies using temporary workers, they're using statement of work workers instead. And I think that has been happening to a certain extent. And it just seems obvious that, given where the market is, given employer preferences, that there is demand for those sorts of solutions. If you're providing those solutions, it is different from providing temporary agency workers. There's different risk characteristics. So you need to be very careful and sure about what you're doing. But we do see that is a potential growth market for temporary staffing firms. So I think, we see a lot of firms that in the past have just been traditional temporary staffing providers, increasingly looking at the delivery of outsourced solutions. And, why shouldn't they? Because, some of the big consulting firms are very happy to step on the toes of the staffing industry and offer temporary workers wherever they can as well. So it seems like there's an increasing overlap between those sort of big consulting firms and the services they provide and the services that staffing firms provide.
Through PGC and obviously Workwell Global, we've seen quite a few recruitment firms pivot in the US in this last 18 months, 2 years, to go down a consultancy-based model. And it is mainly in the IT tech sector in terms of how they supply the services to the clients and how they ultimately position and deliver on that. So I was interested in that because that is something I've seen growing over the last 2 years. And so interesting that that was also included. Well, we're on time and wow, we've covered so much in just 30 minutes. And I thought I'd just quickly summarize some of the key trends that we've talked about, being, first of all, the lazy W, that the market is recovering, but not as quick of a rate as what we thought. And John, although we went through that LinkedIn poll, I think we're probably safe to say we can be cautiously optimistic, but we're definitely not excited. To where I use a lot, but we should be cautiously optimistic, which actually is much more positive than this conversation in January of last year. We also talked about how AI and the user cases that we're seeing is how it's much more penetrative in firms and much is space on further developments coming out there with AI agents now. But also to think about the increasing regulation of AI too and the release of the AI Act in EU. That staff and firms really need to get ahead and be prepped for that and make sure that they're auditing any sort of use of AI within the firms. We talked about just the increasingly, and this is almost in year after year, about US state legislation and, how staff and firms need to be able to cope and manage with that complex interplay of laws. And then lastly, we talked about outsourced solutions and the consultancy model gaining popularity. So we've covered a lot, but before we wrap up, I'm always a keen promoter of SIA because you do so many incredible events throughout the year, and any of the ones that I've attended have always been so valuable. So do you want to let our listeners know kind of what's coming up, what they could get involved in by way of events?
Yeah, well, the next big event is our executive forum in the US, which is in Florida. It's actually in the Fontainebleau Hotel, which, if Americans pronounce it properly, would be Fontainebleau, but they call it the Fontainebleau. And that's on the 10th to the 13th of March. So that's our biggest event of the year. And we'll be covering all these topics that we've covered today in a lot more detail, plus plenty of other things as well. And I mean, obviously in the US, they've now got a new administration, and there's been a huge wave of executive orders, which is likely to have quite a big impact on the job market, and winners and losers. If you're working in AI, then it's good. If you're working in green energy, then it's probably not so good. So yeah, we'll be discussing all those things. So yes, if you want to get some sunshine in March, come to Miami. And then traditionally, European event takes place end of November, beginning of December. The specific date hasn't been confirmed yet, but yeah, it'd be great to see people in London just before Christmas as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, John. That is a wrap on today's session. If you are excited by what you've heard today, or cautiously optimistic, I should probably say, and want to understand more in general about some of the markets that have been covered, then you can access our QR code or link at the end on the screen, which you can use to book in a session with me or one of the team at Workwell Global. We're always more than happy to answer any questions you have from today's session. Next month, we've got another great guest, and we're very excited to release the details of that in the coming weeks. So watch out for that and be sure to register. But other than that, I just want to say thank you, John. Another excellent session. They are absolutely a tradition now, but we appreciate your time and your insight, and I know our audience do too. So thank you for coming, and thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.